Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today's podcast is brought to you by our new book, 50 Dinosaur Tales. If you haven't already ordered it, maybe you should. It's pretty great, I think. The ebook and paperback are available at bit.ly/50 dinosaur tales, the number 50 and then dinosaur tales. And the audiobook is starting to appear in all of the places you can get audiobooks. It's not on Audible yet, but hopefully it will be very soon. So wherever you get your finer audiobooks, check for our book there too. And later in the show, we'll be playing a clip from our book as well. This week, in our 259th episode, we're covering the fourth and final day of SVP, as well as the posters from the third and fourth days. We also have some other non-SVP news. We have an interview with Phoebe Wood, which was also done at SVP. She has an amazing story about a Ankylosaurus model, which she created at the age of 11, and her mom, Jo, also joined us for the interview. And we have Dinosaur of the Day, Chinkonkosaurus. But before we get into all of that, we'd like to thank some of our patrons for keeping our podcast operating this year. And this week, we'd like to thank Kyle, Brendan Kavanaugh, the Tolbert family, Sean Tanagaki, Remy Rodriguez, Rohan, Bradley, Bilal, Avery, Crispy, Jeb from Arkansas, Albertosaurus, Trev, Ayrton and Everett, and Greg.
Yeah, thanks so much for supporting us, and hopefully you enjoyed all of our updates from our Australia road trip, and then of course all the SVP and behind the scenes stuff, or, peeking ahead. If you were a patron, then you knew that this interview was coming up, for example. So yes, thank you so much for your support, and it really helps us to keep this podcast going. If you want to join this awesome group of people, then check out our page at patreon.com/iknowdino.
Yeah, and as a reminder, we have lots of different rewards, ranging from access to the Discord server and the premium content, all the way up to free books and ad-free episodes, and everything in between. So definitely check out our rewards if you're interested in helping out the show and getting some more content. The final day of SVP had lots of amazing dinosaur talks. Up first was Patrick Druckenmiller, who was covering some Alaskan dinosaurs. There are actually quite a few talks that talked about these polar dinosaurs, either from Antarctica or basically from southern Australia, because Australia used to be farther south, and then also a few talks from Alaska. This one especially focused on the Prince Creek Formation, which at the time of the Cretaceous was about 80 to 85 degrees north, and 90 degrees north is as far as it goes, because that's how we measure it. That's the North Pole. So it's really close to the North Pole. But at the time, the poles were a lot warmer. Back then, the mean average temperature throughout the entire year was about 6 degrees Celsius, which is in the 40s Fahrenheit. On a warm month, it would make it all the way up to 14 degrees Celsius, which is something you might get like in Seattle or something. Like it's really not that cold. But in a cold month, it would average about -2 Celsius, which is like 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and obviously below freezing. So if they were purely cold-blooded, that could definitely be a problem for dinosaurs, although obviously we don't really think they were cold-blooded anymore. We think that they had a little bit warmer metabolism than that. And Prince Creek has at least 4 named dinosaurs from it. It's also the farthest north known dinosaur formation, so there's a lot of interesting things we can learn from it. And most importantly, aside from the difference in temperature, is probably how the dark and light cycles affected things. Because it's super weird, but when you're all the way at the North Pole, there's only one sunrise and sunset in the entire year. It's basically the sun slowly spirals up all 182 and a half days. And then while you're tilted towards the sun, which would be in the summer and half of the spring and half of the fall, and then the rest of the year, it's 182 and a half days of darkness, because now the sun has dipped below the horizon. So you get one really long sunrise, then a long day, and then a really long sunset, and then an incredibly long and probably miserable dark night. So that only happens right at the North Pole, exactly on the North Pole, because the rest of it, they get a couple days where the sun dips down and comes back up, but it's still mostly dark for a lot of the year and mostly light for the rest of the year. And at 80 to 85 degrees north, they were definitely experiencing this kind of craziness. Because of that, obviously, when it's in that extended dark period, there's not going to be much of any vegetation for herbivores to eat. So they're going to have some very different adaptations than a dinosaur that lives near the equator, where there's a very consistent life cycle is going to have to adapt to. Patrick was saying that between March and October, there were probably plenty of plants. That would be the time period when the sun is up. But then around October, the leaf fall would happen and, these herbivores might be in trouble. So previously, people have hypothesized that maybe they migrated. And if they didn't migrate, either eating really poor food, kind of like how pandas just eat this really low quality food because they're up in the mountains in the winter and it's the only thing around. Or if they were really small, maybe they could have hibernated or stuck around somehow by reducing their metabolism. Unfortunately, we don't have any evidence for reproduction in the Prince Creek Formation, so we can't say for sure whether or not animals were there year-round. But at the Kakanaut Formation, which was at the time about 70 to 75 degrees north and had about a 10 degrees Celsius mean average temperature, we do have some evidence of really tiny dinosaurs that must have been born there, basically. And 70 to 75 degrees north is still well within the Arctic Circle, because remember, the Arctic Circle is 23.5 degrees. So if you subtract the 90 from 23.5, you get 66.5 degrees north is where the Arctic Circle is. So everything north of that is going to have several days of complete darkness and a really long time with very little sun. Several months where there's not going to be really any plants.
Sounds like a rough life.
Yes, especially for an herbivore. Or maybe for a predator too, because you're going to have to try to find herbivores that are hibernating in burrows or something. But we do think that there were both herbivores and predators there, because there was one really amazing slide that they put up which showed 9 teeth, which all easily fit on the size of one US penny. So imagine the size of a penny, which is, not much bigger than a thumbnail if you're not familiar with US currency. You could fit 9 teeth on it. So obviously these were very, very tiny dinosaurs. Between the 9 teeth, there were both herbivores, specifically ornithischians, and theropods. So we were seeing a pretty good diversity, and obviously that meant that there was pretty established ecosystem there year-round. There were also a lot of great pictures that he showed of individual fossils, and most of the time he used the head of a pin as his scale bar, which is roughly a millimeter long, and some of the teeth were even just the size of 1 cubic millimeter, so just the tiniest little thing that you would never possibly find. So the question that you're probably wondering is how did they even find this thing? If you're out in the field looking at dirt, how are you going to notice something that's a millimeter by a millimeter? It's so tiny. So what they were actually doing was microfossil excavation, which looks a lot like panning for gold. Essentially, it's the same thing where you're just filtering through a small sieve, and then you have to look at it all laboriously and see under a microscope if anything looks like a bone. And hopefully you find some cool stuff. And they found tons of cool stuff.
Sounds like mostly teeth.
Yeah, they did. But they also found a femur that was only about 2.5 millimeters long. And not surprisingly, it's very spongy bone and obviously very, very young, because a femur, our femur is over 1 foot long and relatively thick. Not like dinosaur, not like sauropod, sort of weight support, but a lot longer than 2.5 millimeters. And it's almost certainly from something that was unhatched, or perinatal as they usually put it. They also found a tooth of a leptoceratopsid, which they said is the first occurrence of a baby or perinatal tooth of a leptoceratopsid. So that's pretty cool. It's also neat to see some ceratopsians from up there. To figure out how old that Leptoceratops tooth was, they compared it to a recently described tooth from a Protoceratops, and this tooth was even smaller. So it was likely from an embryo as well, because the one that they were comparing it to is from an embryo, although technically they can't be certain about that because it wasn't found in an egg, but, seems like the most simple explanation. They also found several other types of teeth. They had a thessallosaurid tooth, which is a small ornithopod, so one of those bipedal herbivorous dinosaurs. And when I say small, I mean as an adult, it was also small because obviously we're talking about little tiny microfossils. So clearly the individual was small as well. And they also found juvenile hadrosaur, troodontid, ceratopsid, and pachyrhinosaurus teeth.
It's a lot of variety.
Yeah. In addition, they also found a Nunuxsaurus bone, which was a young of year, they describe it, meaning that it was under 1 year old individual, and some avialans. So that's pretty sweet.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the reason that this is the most significant is that we're now seeing that both theropods and several groups of herbivorous dinosaurs were all reproducing in the Arctic Circle. And we can be pretty confident about this, not only because some of them appeared to be from the size of an animal that would have been still in an egg, but also because even if they were just recently hatched, there's no way that they would have hatched and then traveled thousands of kilometers immediately afterwards, which would mean either they couldn't have been hatched south of the Arctic Circle and marched their way all the way up before they died, and they also couldn't have hatched there and then immediately migrated, because that's what they would have had to do. Since it takes hadrosaurs an estimated 171 days to reproduce, if you think about it that way, no matter when they laid the egg, either the adult or the baby is going to have to spend a significant amount of time in the dark in the Arctic. So we're definitely starting to see more evidence of these year-round habitants in the Arctic, which I just think is fascinating. I have no idea how they did it. It's just crazy. Were they squirreling away leaves? Like, how could they possibly, how do herbivores survive when there's no plants around? It's just crazy.
They had to get creative.
I guess, yeah. The next talk that we saw was by Matthew Carano, and he was talking all about Allosaurus, and specifically how we basically need a neotype. We've talked about this a couple times. There have been a couple papers that have come out and they've said, I also support, making a new Allosaurus holotype essentially, and they call it a neotype because the holotype, as Carano puts it, is a, quote, box of rubble, end quote. So there was a petition that started in 2010 to change the holotype to a new specimen, and specifically this neotype would be a topotype because it came from the same quarry. So it's an even more special version of a neotype called a topotype, because there's always a question when you're changing a holotype if you actually end up with the exact same species, and if you find it in the same spot, you have a much better chance of that.
So if only Marsh had found it first.
Yes.
Had found the topotype first, I mean.
Yeah, like a better specimen. Because, like you're saying, Marsh did name Allosaurus way back in the 1870s, but he didn't do the greatest job ever because,
he's in the middle of the Bone Wars.
Yeah, exactly. And most of our Allosaurus information comes from the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry.
The mystery quarry.
Yeah, it has a really weirdly large number of Allosauruses. Most of the bones from this quarry are different Allosaurus individuals, but they're all jumbled together. So it's not a good place to get a neotype from because all of the bones are kind of mixed up. And then another problem with the holotype is that the monograph that described them is a sort of best case look at the bones. It's not real bones, so they're drawn out, and they're not photographed because this is the 1870s, and they kind of fill in missing pieces of the bone. So it could use some revision, I would say. In addition to just needing a new updated monograph, this new individual is much more complete. As is often the case, Scott Hartman was commissioned to do a skeletal drawing of it, and it's in really great shape. They actually even found most of the tail, but mistakenly they threw part of it away since it was found separately.
Oops.
Yeah, it's not great, especially when later on you decide you want it to be the holotype. And it does have some pathologies too, which are going to get CT scanned and then presented as a new monograph. So that's pretty interesting. But even more interesting, potentially, is that this individual went on display in 1916. Its abbreviation is USNM 4734, which stands for the United States National Museum, also known as the Smithsonian Museum. And you probably know that Research Casting International just redid a bunch of their bones. And in fact, this Allosaurus was included in that. In 2013, they tried to return the Allosaurus to its original condition, which included repairing, in air quotes I should have around repairing, the skull, because the skull was, they tried to reassemble the skull by, kind of filling in some gaps and sticking it back together. But when they did that, they realized that they had accidentally made it 32% shorter than it should have been.
That's a lot shorter.
Yes, it definitely is. And before that, there had been proposals that, maybe it should be a different species and that there's this shorter headed allosaur. But as Carano put it, quote, "There is no such thing as a short-faced allosaur. Please ablate it from your memory," end quote. Which I think is pretty great. So redoing this individual of Allosaurus simultaneously helped us realize that Allosaurus is a little more consistent than we originally thought it was. And on top of that, this one would be a great one to use as a topotype. So hopefully that happens soon. Carano also said the ICZN has yet to make an official ruling, even though the petition was started in 2010. But a lot of that is because people keep commenting, mostly to say that they agree with it. And the ICZN is waiting for the comments to stop. So he politely asked that people stop commenting because it's delaying.
It's an interesting dilemma.
Yeah. Don't say you agree. He was like, if you have something unique to say, you can say it, but don't just say, yes, I agree, because that'll just delay it longer. We might have a new Allosaurus topotype, holotype, neotype pretty soon.
Hard to say. It's been almost 10 years in the making.
Yeah. Next up was a talk by Lindsay Zano, and she was comparing basically when Tyrannosauroids showed up in North America with when Carcharodontosaurians disappeared. So basically thinking about things like Allosaurus starting to disappear. I mean, not Allosaurus, but Allosaurus type ancestors. So not big bone-crushing things like tyrannosaurs. These are things with more slender teeth that are more of like the slicing types like Carcharodontosaurus. So basically what happened was around the time Tyrannosaurians exploded, we start to see some of these basal tetanurans like Carcharodontosaurians disappearing. So the tyrannosaurs seem to be just kind of taking over the ecosystem as far as the whole Northern American super mega apex predator position from everything else. The interesting thing about it is that after discovering Siats, which is an Allosauroid from the late Cretaceous, it really expanded the existence of these Carcharodontosaurians a lot later than we thought they were around. So it kind of overlaps with Tyrannosauroids. Because right around the same time, we were seeing Moros around, which is a tyrannosaur. And it was also North America, so they seem to be overlapping at least a little bit in their existence. So the question is exactly when did tyrannosaurs take over, or did they coexist for a while? Maybe in the same ecosystem as quote-unquote subsidiary predators. So Susquityrannus was about 100 kilograms, whereas Lythornax was greater than 1,200 kilograms, and that was in a 10 to 12 million year span. But while this happened, Laramidia was forming with the Western Interior Seaway, so it was happening more or less in isolation. And then from that, we can test this sort of quote-unquote ecological release of individuals into the ecosystem. So what they found was that there was sort of a random change in mass of tyrannosaurs while allosaurs were still around. But then as soon as they went away, then we start to see a drift towards this larger size, but it doesn't really accelerate in mass. The highest rates of change were near Susquityrannus just before Tyrannosauridae, or what they call stem eutyrannosaurs. So it's kind of a complex growth mechanism, and we're not sure exactly why it happened that way. It's still possible that the increase in mass was a result of their tracking prey. So maybe, the herbivores like Triceratops were getting a lot bigger, and then that's when tyrannosaurs got a lot bigger. And maybe the fact that they did that helped to drive out these Carcharodontosaurians. We're not entirely sure, but it is really interesting that we're starting to see this overlap, because before it's been shown as more of a clean split, where tyrannosaurs just took over right away, but now we're starting to see more of an overlap.
Much messier.
Yep, as usual. Up next, there was a talk by Menglu Ma all about Sinornithomimus, or Sinornithomimus maybe, since it's Sino, like Chinese. But Basically, it was a presentation on a ton of new individuals and a lot of details about the bones. But the summary is that there are 14 new skeletons, 3 of which are subadults to adults, and 11 of which are juveniles. They were all found in 1997 in Western Inner Mongolia. And then in 2001, they found another 13 individuals.
Wow.
Including juveniles.
It's a good growth series.
It really is. And that one included 1 hatchling. And when you combine it with the other finds, there are 22 1 to 2-year-olds, 2 3-year-olds, 1 that's about 7 years old, 1 that's slightly larger than the 7-year-old, and then there's an adult that's about 12 years old. So yeah, it is a really good growth series, but it's kind of weird because there's so many that are 1 to 2 years old. But who knows? Maybe they had a really tough life and most of them were about 1 to 2 years old when they died. Or we just happened to catch some little group of 1 to 2-year-olds that were really unlucky.
Yep.
It's been known to happen. Up next was a talk by Nathan Carroll, which was about a really cool coprolite. There was a lot of coprolite talk at SVP.
It's always fun.
It really is. So this coprolite is especially valuable because of the feather or feathers which are contained within it. Unlike some of the other coprolites we've talked about, this one was really small. His description of it is basically if you make like the OK sign and you have, your thumb and your pointer finger touching, it's smaller than the space that's made by those 2 fingers. So, like a square inch or something. It's pretty tiny. And I think a nugget is a pretty good description for it because of how much cool stuff is in it, despite its small size. Kind of like a gold nugget.
Kind of.
Except it's made out of poop. But so this coprolite has some bones in it, which is common to see in coprolite. It also has medullary pith, which is the foam that fills a rachis, which is the middle sort of stick part of the feather. If you've used in feather in as a quill, it's the part that you dip in ink. That's the rachis. And the bones that are in the coprolite appear to be from birds, as best as we can tell. And then there are a lot of endocasts of what appear to be feathers. Obviously, this was all done with CT scanning because it's such a tiny little thing. If you break it open, it's going to be a mess. You're better off just micro CT scanning it and trying to see everything that's in there really laboriously, but still better off. And inside, they found what appeared to be a downy feather, as well as a contour feather, which are the feathers what you'd see along the body of a dinosaur, not necessarily along the wings, and some things that look quite a bit like scales. And the downy feather appears to have something stuck on it with, quote, enough legs attached to it to be a tick, end quote, and possibly even multiple ticks, because there are a lot of these little things around it that look kind of like ticks grabbing onto the downy feather. Even cooler is that this might be the first modern feather ever seen in 3D, because every other feather that we find gets squished in the fossilization process, and so it kind of gets flattened like you're pressing a flower, whereas this one was preserved in a coprolite, so it was just sort of magically preserved in 3D for us to examine exactly,
through the magic of digestion and not being able to break down the feather.
Yep, exactly. Although I'm not sure exactly how this compares to the Myanmar or Burmese amber finds, because those are pretty much preserved in 3 dimensions as well. Although maybe the way that the amber sticks on top of them, or the tree sap sticks on top of them at the time, maybe that distorts them a little bit. I'm not sure. It's always good to find more dinosaur coprolite, or coprolite with dinosaurs in them. You don't really know what made this one.
Just all the things.
Up next was a really interesting presentation by Tyler Lyson, who was looking at basically what exactly was happening with dinosaur groups at the KPG boundary. So right when dinosaurs went extinct, which dinosaurs were doing the best or the worst, or, maybe weren't around at all. To do this, they looked at primary locations of KPG boundaries, meaning ones that you can definitely tell are on the boundary. And this included 500 locations around Northwest Dakota and Canada, including 84 locations that had plants, 36 that had pollen, and 200 plus that had vertebrates, 100 plus of which had dinosaur skeletons, When you combine all of them, you can find all of the major clades of dinosaurs that we know from the Cretaceous within 5 meters of that Chicxulub impact boundary. So you see, all the ceratopsians and hadrosaurs and tyrannosaurs and troodontids and all that kind of stuff. Although they did see that there were more ceratopsians near the boundary. But this might not mean that ceratopsians were doing better right at that very end of the Cretaceous, because it might just be related to the type of rock that the bones were found in, because ceratopsians are more common in mudstone, and it just turned out that they had a lot more mudstone near that end boundary, and Edmontosaurus tends to show up in sandstone, and yeah, they just didn't find as much sandstone, so unfortunately, it's likely a preservation bias.
Or the ceratopsians were thriving because of their hard heads.
Yeah, or there was some vegetation that was doing better or something.
Yeah.
It was interesting, too, because they also obviously made a comparison to the Deccan eruptions that were going on essentially in India at the time, and have been proposed as an alternative for why the dinosaurs went extinct, because it would have created a lot of climate change with all this crazy amount of volcanic eruption. But during the Deccan eruptions, they said that the diversity of animals, insects, and plants stayed really high, only dropping after the Chicxulub impact. So this might be used as another piece of evidence that really that diversity of dinosaurs stayed consistent all the way right up till the meteor/asteroid hit. And therefore, that's the real nail in the coffin for most dinosaur other than birds. And up very last, at 4 p.m. on Saturday, the last dinosaur talk that we saw was by Christian Heck. And he had a new take on how to sort of determine whether or not Maiasaura switched its gait from bipedal to quadrupedal as it grew, because that's been proposed previously. That when they were little, they were light enough that they could just stand on their hind legs, and then as they got bigger and heavier, they just switched to a quadrupedal stance. But recently, a lot of people have determined that it's more likely that it just stayed quadrupedal the whole time. And they want to take another look at it with a new line of evidence, which is always a good thing to do. It's always good to take multiple looks at the same question rather than just moving on to the next thing, as soon as you have one version of an answer. So what they decided to do was look at a comparison between legs and arms, which we talk about a lot, and how the legs and arms grow, because as we said in another talk, if the arms are getting a lot bigger relative to the speed of how the legs are getting bigger, that shows that the arms are taking on more weight than the legs are in the same period of time. So if you're really like bulking up your arms, it's because you're using your arms for something, essentially, especially if they're bulking up faster than the legs. So unfortunately, where Maiasaura is found, specifically the Two Medicine Formation, everything is kind of jumbled up. We don't have a lot of good skeletons of individuals. What we have instead is bone beds with lots of individuals all scattered together, just like we were talking about with the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry. So you can't really say this arm and this leg go together and then compare it to a bunch of other matching arms and legs and see whether the arms are growing more rapidly than the legs. So instead what they did is they came up with a pretty clever workaround. They used lags to find individuals of the same age. And again, lags are that histology where you slice the bone and they look for the tree ring growth line type things.
And it stands for lines of arrested growth.
Yes, thank you. So if you find one lag, you figure, okay, it's about 1 year old, etc. So when they did that and they plotted all of their lag-aligned arms and legs, they found that the arms and legs were growing about the same over time. So you weren't seeing that the humerus, basically the upper arm bone, was bulking up a lot faster than the femur. They were growing at about the same rate. And therefore, it was probably quadrupedal its whole lives, especially if it started out quadrupedal or ended as quadrupedal. No matter what, it seems like they were staying about the same as they grew. There are obviously a lot of complications, one of which is that for under a year old, you're not going to be able to see any lags, so they all kind of get jumbled together. What they did was that they tried to proportion them based on size, but that's starting to get a little bit messy because not everything's going to grow at the same rate, and we're already trying to compare growth rates, so that's can be a little dicey. And then obviously there are going to be a lot of imperfect matches because we're just looking at arms and legs of the same age individual. So if there's any sexual dimorphism, any variation between individuals, or any other issues with why an individual might be bigger than another, like a pathology or something, you're going to have errors in your data. But when you average everything together, that should help eliminate outliers. And we do see that it appears that they grew around the same rate. So I think it's another good piece of evidence that Maiasaura probably was quadrupedal its whole life. We also have a few posters to talk about from the last 2 days of SVP. One of them was by Jay Rousseau, and he had a poster all about a new basal ankylosaur, possibly the most basal ankylosaur. And it looks like a really cool find. We're going to have to wait till this is published until we can find out more about it. But they found a good portion of the length of the body, including tons of osteoderms, some limb bones, and I think the hips and skull were in there too. So it's going to be a really cool find. Obviously it doesn't have a name yet, but it is from the Jurassic and it's from Portugal. So if you're a fan of Portuguese dinosaurs or ankylosaurs or Jurassic, it's all good stuff. Savannah Carpenter also had a poster about some new ceratopsians from Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And one of them is a little bit more like Avaceratops. If you're familiar with that dinosaur, it was a pretty cool one recently described. The other one looks a little bit more like Diabloceratops, which is super awesome with the big horns sticking up out of the frill, kind of curving outwards, all devilishly.
I'm surprised you don't like ceratopsians more than ankylosaurs.
Yeah, that's true. They're both armored and awesome. But these two don't have names yet, unfortunately. Hopefully we'll find out more soon, and maybe they'll even find some more skulls from the area, as long as we can keep doing paleontology in the area.
This next one isn't Dinosaur, but it's still pretty cool, by J.P. Rio, and it was about a supermatrix of crocodilians, which is kind of similar to Emmanuel Schopp's supermatrix on sauropods. So there's your dinosaur connection. They spent 3 years measuring a bunch of crocodilian bones, and then they put them all together in the phylogeny. So they came up with a result, and it places a lot of crocodilians that were previously hard to figure out.
Yeah, that's pretty neat.
Stuart Samita had a second poster, also about Dimetrodon, except this one was about how they found several species in different sizes, and the smallest one was about the size of a cat.
Yeah, he mentioned that he would really appreciate one as a pet.
Yeah, it'd be pretty cute. They also did full-scale drawings on the poster of all the femora, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, it really gave you a good sense of scale of how big the legs were on the cat-sized one all the way up to the huge monsters.
Which, yes, we realize they're not dinosaurs, but they're still cool.
Still Mesozoic megafauna. Although they're synapsids, they're not even diapsids. So they're closer related to us than they are to dinosaurs. But still, they always come in those little toy packs when you get dinosaurs, along with mosasaurs now. We also saw a really cool poster from M.V. Connolly at the Tate Geological Museum, which included some really cool new sauropod discoveries, which definitely hadn't been found yet, or at least weren't in the state to be shown in a display case when we went through the Tate Museum about 3 or 4 years ago. But it was kind of fun because Emmanuel Schopp was talking when we were there, and he was like, when can I look at these sauropods?
I think we were kind of joking with him, when are you going there?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Connolly was asking too. But basically, they found a couple of sauropod feet, which are now articulated and still aren't quite on display at the museum yet. And there's also a diplodocid skull, which is currently being prepped out of the rock. And it's only about half as big as an adult skull, but it's kind of squished down in the rock. So it's only a couple of inches wide because it's kind of smashed up. But since the fossil is so fragile, the prep work is kind of slow going. But we will soon have another diplodocid or diplodocid skull, as well as these really cool feet. So new dinosaurs coming out, new spots.
So that's all our SVP 2019 coverage from Brisbane, Australia. It was a good year.
Yeah, and we had a really amazing time at the conference. We got to meet a bundle of listeners and had a really awesome time talking to them about not just dinosaurs, but all sorts of fun Australian stuff.
Yeah, as you know, too, we did a lot of really great interviews, which we are still releasing. You may have noticed one a week so that we're not too far behind.
Yeah, I think next week we're taking a very brief hiatus from SVP interviews because we've got an interview that's been waiting to be published for a while, but then we're going to go back and have another SVP interview and then continue on with all the Australian road trip interviews that we did for museums all across the outback and also cities in Australia, not just the outback.
Yeah, and keep an eye out on our YouTube channel too. We'll be releasing some videos about that trip.
Yeah, Sabrina's hard at work finishing those videos.
So, in non-SVP news, because there's a little bit of that. Well, there's a lot of that, but you'll hear more about it in the coming weeks.
I've been slacking.
I can call it slacking. There's been a lot to cover.
We don't want the episodes to be like 4 hours long.
Anyway, in Washington, in the U.S., Burke Museum has a new exhibit called Fossils Uncovered. And when you go through it, you see specimens from 541 million years ago. And then it also shows the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic, mammals.
Cool. Goes along with their new T-Rex skull that they're still excavating, or preparing, I should say.
Yeah, they've got a lot of cool stuff coming out. The next thanks to Chris, who shared this one with us via Twitter. So NASA scientist Jesse Christensen created a really cool animation, and it shows how long dinosaurs lived by tracing our solar system's movement through the Milky Way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's about 1 minute long, and it maps out dinosaur evolution through the galaxy's rotation. So the gist is the sun takes about 250 million years to orbit the center of the galaxy. In the video, it says 200, but then she said later it's closer to 250. And in the video, you see different periods of the Mesozoic. I think it's mostly the Jurassic and Cretaceous, and then where our solar system was in the Milky Way when those dinosaurs lived. And then it kind of points out, okay, this is when this dinosaur lived.
Yeah, it gives you a good sense of scale of how far apart the dinosaurs lived too. That the solar system moved through a full hour of a clock worth of rotation around the center of the galaxy.
Yeah, so a good sense of just how different their world was, depending on which dinosaur you're talking about. So a few notes, like I said, things aren't exactly the way it's laid out in the video. So other stars and planetary systems in the galaxy, they move at different speeds and in different orbits. And also our galaxy is moving through space. So Christian said, quote, "The animation kind of makes it seem like we've come back to the same spot, but in reality, the whole galaxy has moved a very long way. It's more like we're doing a spiral through space. As the whole galaxy is moving and we're rotating around the center, it kind of creates this spiral," end quote. Luckily for us, though, our solar system stays about the same distance away from the center of the Milky Way. And that's a good thing because the center has a lot of stars and it's unstable and there's a lot of radiation. So not being in the center makes it possible to have life on Earth.
I think it's also full of supermassive black holes, right? Which also seems kind of dicey.
Yeah, that sounds familiar, but I am no expert in space.
Me either. It freaks me out. I don't like thinking of things beyond Earth, or at the very least our solar system. It's too much.
Oh.
There's too much out there. It's like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where there's the room and it's like, you are here in the whole universe of everything. I don't want to think about it. Too insignificant. I already know, but I don't want to think about it.
That's fair. I like thinking about it, but actually I might like thinking about it more now that I've seen it in relation to dinosaurs.
It does help. Whenever you tie dinosaurs into things, it makes it a little easier to swallow.
Next, thanks to Devin from Horse Archer Productions, who shared their new web series, A Million Bones of Stone, which is this educational video series about paleontology. So the first episode's up, and it's about Laelaps. The video is about 10 minutes long. If you want to watch it, it tells you the story of Laelaps, which if you listen to our Bone Wars episode, in episode 250, you can probably guess that this video also covers some of the Bone Wars.
Yep.
So the video has the description of Laelaps and also how it became Dryptosaurus. We'll share a link.
Yeah, if you want to see some of the visuals that go along with what Sabrina was describing, it's a nice little video.
And last, a quick update on Jurassic World 3. Justice Smith and Daniella Pineda, who played Franklin and Zia, will be in the movie along with Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard, which might not surprise you, but it seems like they're bringing everybody back for this last movie.
With all the list of people, I'm imagining everybody having 10 seconds of screen time before they move on to the next group.
Makes sense if you're going to show dinosaurs in different parts of the world.
Oh, yeah.
And you got a bunch of different characters to work with.
Yeah, that's true.
So we'll see.
And before we get into our interview with Phoebe, we want to quickly play an excerpt from our new book so that you can hear what the book sounds like if you're interested in the audiobook, or if you're interested in reading it, you can just find out what is in the book. But the only way we can share it with you through a podcast is in audio form. So without further ado, here is Sabrina reading one of the stories from 50 Dinosaur Tales.
Wearosaurus pobeni. Wewera lizard. Look to the right. Nothing. Good. Look to the left. Still nothing. Good. Tilt head back to the right. What's that crackling sound? Just a fellow Wearosaurus pobeni taking a step. Good. Wearosaurus has been on guard for hours with her brother and sister, watching over her family's territory. The 3 ornithopods stand in a semicircle, ready to sound the alarm at any moment if necessary. The rest of her family is busy foraging for food. Wearosaurus doesn't mind. She has an important job, to keep her family safe. After her shift ends, she will be able to eat. They are in a particularly lush area. Sweet, fresh vegetation is everywhere. Wearosaurus knows that she won't have any problem finding a snack later. Like the rest of her family, Wearosaurus is a small animal, and living in a group has a lot of advantages. Someone is always watching for threats, so it's safe to concentrate on finding food. If there are any threats, Wearosaurus can band together and show their strength in numbers. At night, everyone cuddles for warmth. Most of the time, guard duty is uneventful, but it is also exhausting. Wearosaurus is on constant alert, looking in all directions and listening for any unusual sounds. Even normal sounds require scrutiny. A small splash could be her brother taking a drink or a potential predator dipping its toes into her family's usual watering hole. To be an effective sentry, Wearosaurus must stand upright on 2 legs, her head held high. She likes to stand on her toes to get the best view. Wearosaurus never takes a break, not even when her legs feel tired. Her job is too important. Wearosaurus hears a smacking sound. She turns her head and sees her brother chewing on a plant. He's on all fours and has used his beak to crop off a few tender leaves. Wearosaurus moves to his side and smacks him with her tail, a warning that he should respect his duties. He flinches and stares at her for a moment, still chewing. Then he swallows and stands up straight. Wearosaurus moves back to her post and looks away from him to show her disapproval. She has a reputation in the family for being a reliable guard, and she doesn't want her brother to ruin it. Luckily, her duties are almost done for the day. The sun is low in the sky, and the foraging family members are looking full. Wearosaurus looks over to her mother, the leader of their group, for a sign that they're ready to go home. Her mother notices the sun and lets out a quick grunt. Everyone stops feeding and lifts their heads. As a unit, they start to move back to their home for the night. Wearosaurus quickly bends down into a quadrupedal position and heads to the nearest plant. She picks off as many leaves as she can with her beak. Once her mouth is full, she runs to catch up with the rest of the group, chewing as she goes. Her brother and sister follow. Wearosaurus is satisfied. Another job well done.
After that, there was also a list of facts, which I read, but we cut them out because it's made it a little bit too long. And I think Sabrina did a great job reading that.
Oh, thank you.
If you're interested in getting it, you can just search for 50 Dinosaur Tales. And if you want the ebook or paperback version, you can get it at bit.ly/50 Dinosaur Tales. And it's 50 dinosaur tales as in stories, because there are 50 stories. 49 more, like the one you just heard. And now on to our interview with Phoebe and Joe Wood.
We're chatting today with Phoebe Wood, who is a primary student in Adelaide, Australia, and she won the Oliphant Trophy and the Oliphant Science Awards in the statewide competition of South Australia because she built this amazing Ankylosaurus huxleyi model that is actually on display right now at the South Australian Museum. And we're also here with her mom, Joe Wood. So thanks for taking time out of SVP, because I know you're trying to see a lot of the sessions.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've spent 400 hours on this model. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Oh, a bit exhausting, but it wasn't too bad because I only did it for fun. If it wasn't fun, I think I would have stopped at the 3-hour mark.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, and you've got probably hundreds of hours of research into this.
Yeah, that's around half of the time that was put into the project was just research.
It makes sense. How did you find out about Anchiornis and decide that you wanted to make a sculpture of it?
Well, I chose Anchiornis because I'm not really sure. It's just always been encouraged to do science by my parents, my mum and my dad. And I always knew I was going to go into science. I just never sure what type. When I was about 8, I really got into birds, and so I wanted to be an ornithologist. I still want to be an ornithologist, but that's a separate part of this now.
Sure.
My grandma gave me this book. It's Field Guide to Mesozoic Birds and Other Feathered Dinosaurs. It was really the next step from modern birds to dinosaurs. And I thought, why do a modern bird that already exists that everybody knows what it looks like when I can do something that not many people have seen?
Mm-hmm.
It's less common. And also they were fascinating. I couldn't decide if I wanted to do a dinosaur or a bird, so I went halfway between. And I chose Anchiornis because, well, for one, it was a cool dinosaur.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the others that I felt like doing were too big because the elephants has a size limit. It's really annoying.
And you wanted it to be full scale?
Yeah. And one of the others that I tried was a striped crested dragon.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't much information on that one, so I chose Anchiornis because I didn't want to do something like Archaeopteryx because everybody knows Archaeopteryx.
Mm-hmm.
But Anchiornis, fewer people have heard of, yet there is still enough information for me to do something decent on.
Yeah. And so your model is half skeletal, right? And then half, how would you describe it?
Feathered.
Half feathered and how it would look in real life. That's
Mm-hmm.
what I always describe it as.
And how did you make the feathers?
Well, I didn't really. They're actually feathers that my mum got from dead magpies we picked up on the side of the road.
Yeah, that was my only role. I had to pick up dead magpies and pluck them.
That's amazing.
It's an important role.
I also took pictures of everything that I did.
Yeah, and I was the photographer.
Yeah.
Also important. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. These photos, are amazing. And you had to do this after school and on weekends.
Yeah. I really wanted to do this for some time, but it's a school entry thing,
Mm-hmm.
and our school didn't do it. So Mum talked to the principal, who was Barb at the time, and she said that we could do it as long as Mum was the school coordinator. Mum said yes, because
Of course.
she's a wonderful mum.
Oh.
Thanks, sweetie.
So you had another role, not just
Yeah.
dead
Yeah.
magpies.
Yeah, I'm sweet mum.
And then the only catch of that is that whatever we do has to fit the school topic. Every term we have a topic. And the term that we're doing the elephants happened to be compost. And Anchiornis huxleyi doesn't really fit in compost.
Mm-hmm.
I could have tweaked it to make it fit, but I don't think the school would have liked that. So I ended up doing 3 projects in the same time. One was a board game, a compost board game called From Rot to Plot, sorry. And I did that with 2 friends. Another one was a photography, many types of flight in nature.
Nice. But with Anchiornis, did you read the paper about its coloration? Was that part of what made you want to create it?
Not really, because they have proven its colour, and so it's more so the pictures of the colour that are more intriguing. Yes, how it looks is definitely a reason why I wanted to do it. It is a really cool looking dinosaur.
Mm-hmm. And you also reached out to a lot of paleontologists and got their advice or...
Scott Hartman and Michael Pittman. Michael Pittman worked on a number of Anchiornis huxleyi related papers about the soft tissue and how they can detect it. And Scott Hartman is a paleo artist who draws the skeletal structures, with also showing where the soft tissue would go over that. So his drawings were really helpful over the project because I pretty much based my whole project off of his skeletal drawing. So I actually had to ask him permission to use it because I was worried it was copyright. But he said, according to his website, he doesn't really think it is copyright because I'm not physically copying, pasting his work.
Right, you're
into
not
it and
tracing.
saying it's mine.
Mm-hmm.
Though I did actually trace part of it I traced it up to my scale as a guide for the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as good though without all the shading and.
So what materials did you use to build?
For the side that looks like it would be in real life, I used a heat moldable plastic called Warbler. Warbler is actually also biodegradable.
There's a link to compost right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dead animals fit that too.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's made out of compost.
I didn't know what I was going to make. In my defense, I did not know what I was going to make it out of at the time.
Right.
So could have just done biodegradable materials and making an Ankylosaurus huxley model. That would have been really helpful. I tried many different things when I started making it. Tried a few different methods of paper mache and a few different clays to try and make it, but there's also a weight restriction with the elephants, so I
Really?
I was a bit careful about what materials I could use.
Mm-hmm.
What was the weight restriction?
8 kilos.
Oh,
Yeah.
Wow.
It's
Yeah.
really light.
Yeah.
So metal's pretty much out at that point.
Yeah.
And then what about for the skeleton part?
When I got stuck, I went to this place called Adelaide Moulding and Casting. It's a shop, and I asked what materials would be good to use, and I ended up taking home this sample of a substance called Warbler that's biodegradable, as I said, and heat moldable. When I got it back the first time, I made 2 skulls with it. The first one melted, so I made the second one, which is what's actually on him in the end.
Amazing. So for people who are listening, can you describe it a little bit, the colors and things like that?
It's really fluffy on one side, so a few of the feathers stick up in odd angles. And there are loads of different layers of feathers, so it looks pretty much like a really fluffy bird with a dinosaur head. And its wings, sort of striped. Each layer of feathers has white feathers with black tips, but there are 4 layers across it, so it looks striped. And the back leg has the same sort of coloration without the multiple layers. The claws on the living side are black, but the ones on the skeleton side are white.
Mm-hmm.
The model's positioned on a log, and he's holding onto it with the skeleton hand, and the other side is the wing that is free from the log, and the bones are white, but the skull is a brownish colour.
Mm-hmm.
There's a line across the forehead of the skull where the representative of the flesh is built up
Oh.
to show the actual face.
Oh, wow.
And his eye on the living side is clear because at the time I had no information as to what the eye colour would be.
Yeah, so I don't think we know now either.
Right.
They actually do, but
Oh, they do? What is it?
Another
Yeah, we just
conversation.
found out the other day.
since we've come to the conference, we've actually met the people who worked on the papers, and they've actually told us new revelation. They actually know. So need to change that when I get them back.
I don't think it's been published yet.
Gotcha.
Okay, got it.
So with I see that the most of the body feathers are all black. I'm assuming those are the magpie ones.
They're actually a dark grey, so they are all magpie feathers.
That's a lot of
except for
feathers.
the crest and its tail. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention in the description, it has a orange crest in its head, so it looks pretty funky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's from something else that's like just a normal fabric
That's
material?
a chicken.
Oh, really? So those are also bird feathers?
Yeah, and the tail's feathers are another type of chicken.
Amazing.
What about the white feathers? Are those
Magpies.
That's magpie.
Okay.
though.
nice?
Yeah.
This was at the
Open
Oliphant
Day.
Science Awards open day.
Oh, yes.
They
So,
have prize winners in every section because there's the models and inventions
Mhm.
from all the way up to R to 12, but they're at each individual section, and I was in year 6 to 7, and I got first for that. And then
and you were
there's-
surprised by it, right?
Yeah. Well, not really. It was. I was hopeful that I'd get something. Not entirely sure what everybody else has done, though, because you don't know until the open day. And even then, all you know is that you've got something. All they have is a sticker that says prize winner. It is really annoying. It's just a yellow sticker with the words prize winner written across it. You do not know until the presentation night. There is a reason that they keep it secret, is because people who win third prize often do not turn up to collect their prize because they don't know what they've got. They're just like, I don't want that. I don't want to be there and go, I won third prize and I'm really happy. No, I want to get first prize. There's no point taking a night out of my other work. So loads of people don't turn up. So now they do it a different way. So if you want to know what you've got, you have to turn up.
Gotcha.
And then after you won the prize, that's when you were invited to Flinders Paleo
Yeah.
in Adelaide.
Michael Mills was actually there on the open day. He's stage name Professor Flint. He's a singing paleontologist. And yeah, he invited me to the paleo department.
Do you have a plan for what you're going to make next? Or are you already making something new?
Yes, I am. I've been trying to keep it a secret, but I accidentally let it slip a bit over the last few days. I really don't want to say because this model was meant to be an animatronic model, and that did not end up happening. So I may end up just with another still model next year, but I do want to try something of what I was aiming for this year.
Yeah. Well, we heard you'd already been offered a job at SVP, so that's how good your work is.
Yeah, model making job.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Pleasure.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks again, Phoebe and Joe, for chatting with us at SVP, taking time out of your busy schedule. A couple notes about the awards that Phoebe won, because we didn't really spell it out too well in the interview. The Oliphant Science Awards have been going on for 39 years, and they're the largest science awards for any schools in South Australia. Phoebe won first place for the Models and Inventions category for years 6 to 7. Then she won the top prize for primary schools, the Young Scientist of the Year 2019. And finally, she won the overarching top prize, which is called the Oliphant Trophy, and it was the first time ever that a primary student had won that.
And as part of our Australian road trip, we made it to the South Australian Museum and saw Phoebe's Ankylosaurus model, and it was spectacular.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's in there, I think it's called the Discovery Room, and we posted a picture of her Ankylosaurus on our Instagram, so if you want to see what it looks like, check it out there.
And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Tinkankosaurus, which was a request from Tyrant King via Patreon and Discord. So thanks. It was a theropod that lived in the late Cretaceous in what is now Shandong province in eastern China in the Guangxi group. There's only one species, Tinkankosaurus fragilis, and it's named for the village, Tinkanko, or Dingango. I saw several spellings of this, but that's common when it comes to romanization of Chinese words. And it was near where it was found. It was described by Yang Zhongjian, also known as C.C. Young, in 1958 based on one scapula, which he said was basically like Allosaurus but smaller. Some scientists thought that the scapula, the shoulder bone, was a rib or part of a gastralia, but a 2013 study found that to be unlikely. Dan Scher assigned the fossil to Sauropod in 2001, and then a few years later, scientists refined that to a Tyrannosauroid.
So it's switched over compared to what we were talking about with the Tyrannosauroids taking over from the Carcharodontosaurians. People at first thought it was a Carcharodontosaur, or at least an Allosauroid, and now we think it was a Tyrannosauroid. But there isn't much more to say about this one because we only have that one bone. And our fun fact of the day is about Ankylosaurus, because obviously, how could I not make it about Ankylosaurus? When Phoebe put so much effort in research into her Ankylosaurus sculpture, I feel like I need to do a little Ankylosaurus research myself. So there have been 2 Ankylosaurus specimens that have been studied for their coloration patterns. Both were studied with microscopes looking for shapes of melanosomes. And we've talked about that a little bit before. Basically, melanosomes are these little tiny organelles within the body, and they produce melanin. And depending on which type of melanin they create, they make your hair different colors if you're a mammal, or your feathers different colors if you're a dinosaur. So what they did was they compared them to modern melanosomes, and depending on the shape, they could guess which type of melanosome it is, therefore what type of melanin they would produce, and therefore what color feathers they would create on, say, an Anchiornis. So the first study is the one that Phoebe's reconstruction is based on. It's mostly black. It has some white accents on the wings and I think a little bit around the rest of the body. And then it has a big red tuft on the top of its head. So that one's the phaeomelanosome. It's the same thing that gives me the red tuft of hair on the top of my head. So yeah, basically red-headed hair uses the same melanosomes. But the second specimen that was studied didn't find any phaeomelanosomes on the head. So in other words, they didn't recover this red tuft on the head. They gave a lot of different reasons for it. And they said, quote, several explanations might account for these discrepancies, including ontogeny, intraspecific variability, and sexual dimorphism, as well as taphonomy and or sampling, that is, different regions within a multicolored crest, end quote. So in other words, it could be that maybe it wasn't just a solid red crest and it had like little bits of black or something in it, and therefore they just sampled different parts of the crest. And so one of them sampled a part that was black and the other one sampled a part that was red, and they both decided the whole thing was that color. Or it could be that, say, like males had a red tuft on the top of their head, but females didn't. And so we have one male and one female. Or that just during the fossilization process, the phaeomelanosomes just didn't preserve. A lot of other possibilities, but I think the most relevant might be to look at how modern birds are, because if you look at skeletons of a lot of birds, they'll look identical, but then if you look at them while they're alive, they can have very different coloration patterns, including how we have different species and subspecies of birds that are nearly identical other than their coloration patterns. So it does seem that if all of a sudden we can get all this detail about what color these dinosaurs were, we'd be likely to see a lot more variability than we see in just the bones alone. So who knows, but we're not exactly sure what Anchiornis looked like, and especially not sure if they all look the same.
That wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes. And if you want to join our growing community, check out our page at patreon.com/iknowdino. Thanks again, and until next time.
Good day.